If everyone can do us a favor, please download and donate to Politicking if you already haven't. I'd also ask you to share this with as many people as you possibly can. I know a lot of folks are taking lunch. And here we have Senator Durbin. How are you, Senator?
I'm great. How are you doing today?
I'm excellent. It's so good to speak with you today. And we just are absolutely grateful for the opportunity, amongst all of the things that you're doing in the Senate, to hear from you yourself about what's happening today. We're living in somewhat peerless times, but it's a pleasure to always look to your leadership and your words about the future to really understand that there is hope and there's certainly progress to be expected. And I won't take any more of your time. I'll let you introduce yourself for those who already don't know who you are. But to everyone who's joining us today, we're speaking with Senator Dick Durbin.
Well, it's an honor to be with you. And I want to just say a few words about what I think is a state of play of politics as we see it today. And there are two or three major elements that we're facing. First is pandemic, which a friend of mine, State Representative Cam Buckner, who represents an area near Hyde Park in Chicago, is credited with saying, this pandemic will not break us, but it will teach us where our system is broken. And I think we've seen that, have we not? Particularly when it comes to the disparity in healthcare, how a disproportionate number of Hispanics and African Americans are becoming infected and dying. And it really is an indication. Many of them have underlying physical conditions, medical conditions that have been poorly treated, if at all. And when something like this virus comes along, they're the first casualties. So it should open our eyes to the reality of healthcare in this country. Secondly, we are dealing with an economy that is struggling with some 47 million unemployed Americans, one of the highest levels of unemployment in modern memory. And of course, these families face real hardship just making ends meet when they've lost their jobs. How do you pay for your health insurance? How do you make sure the mortgage payment's made, the rent payment's made, food on the table, clothes for the kids, all the basics of life? And so we put a rescue package together called the CARES Act, March 16th, passed 96-0 in the Senate, but parts of it, like unemployment compensation, the federal part, expires at the end of this month. So we have to do something. And Senator McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, decides when and if we take up an issue. So we're hoping that he'll see the immediacy of this particular issue. And when we return next week, start us working toward the next relief package, which I think is important for our economy. The third issue is one that has arisen in the last 6 or 7 weeks and really came to everyone's attention with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Those 8 minutes and 46 seconds when he was murdered on that curbside in Minneapolis has been a change, a life change for America and in some parts for the world. I was looking for sporting events because there aren't many on TV, and I came across a sporting event in Italy where they were playing soccer, what they call football. And before the match started, the players on both sides took a knee on the pitch, as they call it, on the field for a few brief moments in respect for Black Lives Matter. And I'm thinking, it's everywhere. It's all over the world, this whole conversation. And what I found most interesting as a person who's been involved in politics for a large part of my life, I look at the organizers and leaders, and they are not the traditional people. They are new faces. They're younger. They're black, white, and brown. And they're doing amazing things in places that are really unexpected. When I'm going to a Black Lives Matter rally in Jerseyville, Illinois, 300 miles south of Chicago, in a county which may or may not have any African-American residents, I'm thinking to myself, what is going on here? And I'm meeting the organizer. Her name is Leilani Davis. And Leilani is a junior in high school, African-American young woman, junior in high school, 30 miles away in Alton, Illinois. And she said, we're gonna have a Black Lives Matter rally in Jerseyville. And I thought, boy, that's something. You know, most people in high school are too shy to, go out and try to gather groups together for anything. She
Okay.
asked for a rally. Well, I got there and it was supposed to be at 4 o'clock and there were about 40 people there. And I thought, well, that's not bad. And then about 10 minutes later, I looked up and there were 140. And within the next 40 minutes, we were up to over 300 had shown up in Jerseyville, Illinois. And some of the people who were going to be hooting and hollering and complaining just melted away when this crowd got bigger and bigger. And she got up and the first thing she said was, listen, they're going to come by with Confederate flags. They're going to be screaming at us. They may even throw some stuff at it. We're not going to do any of that stuff back at it. We know how to do this. We're going to do it right. We're going to do it our way. And I thought, this is a junior in high school, for goodness sakes. And she not only is inspired by the cause, but she is going to be developed into a great leader. I'm sure she will be. Same thing happened in Springfield with a woman named Nikela Henderson, who just came out of junior year in high school, African-American woman, and organized 1,500 peaceful students on Black Lives Matter. So we're seeing changes. 4 or 5 years ago, if you said Black Lives Matter, it really was fighting words, people in this camp and that camp. Now look what's happening. You have a majority of Republicans who have positive feelings about Black Lives Matter, not to mention Democrats and independents. And you think back of Colin Kaepernick and how when this man knelt down during the national anthem, this was a scandalous activity reported by the president, complained by people right and left that it was the wrong thing to do. And now it has become kind of a symbol of where are you in America in the 21st century. So those three things, the pandemic, the state of the economy, Black Lives Matter, and here we are just a few weeks away from election, presidential election. So it's an interesting time to be in politics.
I can imagine. So you talked about just recent transformations we've seen with how people perceive Black Lives Matter, how Republicans are receiving the movement, but frankly, how the movement transcends beyond party. At least that's what I see. I'd like for you to walk us back years ago to the start of your public service career. What got you inspired and what got you engaged? Was your path to the Senate somewhat straightforward, or is it something that you hadn't actually expected?
We had a fellow named Jim Thompson, who was the governor of our state for a longer period than anyone else. And he used to tell a story that when he was 7 or 8 years old, he remembers sitting around dinner with his family and saying to them, one day I'm going to grow up to be president of the United States or chief justice of the Supreme Court. And I thought to myself, when I was 8 years old and I was sitting around talking to my family, I said, one day I'd like to own a two-wheel bicycle. I mean, I had no goal of being president or anything like that.
Okay.
I like to say to my audiences, I was a normal kid. I enjoyed being a kid. And I didn't think about some lofty goal or mission in life. So then fast forward, and I end up going to Georgetown University. I'm in the School of Foreign Service, which I'm thinking maybe I'll go into the Foreign Service, maybe. And then just by accident, literally by accident, my roommate gets a job as an intern in the office of a U.S. Senator from Illinois. And so it turns out he loves it. And he asked, and they said, sure, we'll take Durbin too. So I was an intern in the senator's office, and I just absolutely was swept away, not just by working on Capitol Hill and being around the Senate, but because this man, whose name was Paul Douglas, was such an inspirational person and so kind to me. And he introduced me to a fellow named Paul Simon, who became the lieutenant governor of the state, a congressman, a senator, and ran for president himself. And I worked for him all those years. So I think the turning point in my life when I started thinking about maybe government and politics will be for me was because I had mentors like Douglas and Simon and role models that I could identify with and think, these are good people. I'd like to do something good with my life. So I went to work for Simon in the state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, worked up the courage to run for office, ran for state senator and lost, ran for lieutenant governor and lost, ran for delegate to the convention and lost. And the fourth time I ended up winning for the United States House of Representatives. But it isn't as if I had a mission or a plan in life. I just saw an interesting life that I thought would be valuable to do. And I had mentors and role models to look at.
Your persistence is something that I'm certainly familiar with and that I appreciate you being transparent about as it pertains to your career today. It's also something that you have to be very practical about and that you have to put first in everything that you do. I'd like for you to tell us how you've been persistent in pushing some police reform legislation in the Senate. I appreciated your words on making sure that we have something that's supported by both parties, but I'd like to know what that actually looks like today.
Are you talking about police reform?
That's right.
Well, I'll tell you what it looks like. It is a list of laws, changes in the law, put together by my friends Cory Booker and Kamala Harris.
That's right.
And I joined them in the effort because I'm on the Judiciary Committee and I've worked with both of them. I think they're both terrific legislators. And what we did was to gather together the strongest ideas, starting with the obvious, ending chokeholds in this country, the kind of tactic that was used that killed George Floyd and many others, unfortunately. Making certain that we have a registry of misconduct by police so that a bad actor doesn't go after being fired in one police department to another police department without some knowledge of what has happened before. Licensing of law enforcement. We license so many different things in our state and nation. We should have a licensure there as well to establish standards for professionalism and also to have reporting. We talked as well about video cameras. Video cameras and DNA evidence have changed the national conversation about law enforcement justice, and they're going to continue to. It's no longer a speculation. Well, what happened to George Floyd? How did that man happen to die? Well, if there had not been a video camera there, you would have heard a different story than what actually happened. You know, and we know that from the past. We don't want to see that in the future. Making certain that we have good standards for recruiting, retention, accountability when it comes to the police, taking into consideration some of the jobs that we give police today that frankly they are not trained to handle. Think of how many times a policeman or woman comes in contact with a person with mental illness. Now, how much training does that law enforcement official have when it comes to recognizing that this is mental illness? This is not a threat to my life. This person needs some counseling, some help. I don't need to pull out my gun on this person, you know. So we ask of our police an awful lot of these things. We need to be able to investigate police departments that are showing patterns of racism, for example. We need to have what's known to get rid of something called qualified immunity. So those who are victims of police misconduct, members of their family can be compensated for civil damages, in addition to any criminal penalty, civil damages, usually through an insurance policy. So it's a variety of things endorsed by every major civil rights group. Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, would not let us call it on the floor of the Senate, but we're not giving up because the people who are the millions who are stepping out now and expressing themselves on Black Lives Matter are looking at me and looking at people like me and saying, you're the grown-up in the room, now do something. We don't want to be growing up with racism. We don't want to raise our children in racism. So make this a better place.
Yeah, and we really do appreciate your transparency as to what's happening on the bill. But we know enough to know that that's not the only issue that the Senate is dealing with. Politicking, which is a political information platform that helps everyone understand what's happening with elections at the local, state, and federal level, has covered the Senate extensively. And I'd like to know from you about some other issues that you're championing, that you really, really want folks to understand you're taking seriously, you're making your priority, and that you also will not give up on.
20 years ago, I had a young woman contact my office in Chicago. She'd come to the United States from Korea.
Wow.
And she overstayed her visitor's visa at the age of 2. She grew up in Chicago with a poor family, and she went to the Chicago Public Schools, and she became part of something called the Merit Music Program. And it turns out she was very talented when it came to playing the piano. And so she developed her skills, and then her teacher said, well, you ought to apply to the Juilliard School of Music in New York and the Manhattan Conservatory of Music. She didn't want to do it, but she started to fill out the application, and she came to the question which said citizenship status. And she said to her mom, what am I? Her mom said, I don't know. We better call Durbin's office. So they called our office, and we checked the law, and it turns out she was undocumented and literally did not comply with the laws of immigration in the United States. The law said that she had to leave the United States for 10 years and apply to come back in. She was 17 years old. She'd been here for 15 years, and she was supposed to leave for 10 years. So I said, that's not fair. She was brought here at the age of 2, and she shouldn't have to go through this. So I introduced something called the Dream Act 20 years ago, which would have taken care of her, this young Korean girl. And we tried for years and years to pass it. One of my colleagues in the Senate went on to be president, a fellow named Barack Obama. And I wrote him a letter and said, can you, by executive order, help these dreamers? He created something called DACA as a result of it. 800,000 young people like this young girl were able to be protected from deportation and legally work in this country for 2 years at a time. So fast forward, that has been, was eliminated by President Trump in September of 2017. And just 4 weeks ago, the US Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts wrote an opinion and said Trump did it all wrong. He didn't legally eliminate the program, and what he did has to be done all over again in a much different way. So there's a new breath of life and possibility. But I've been at this for 20 years, and I have a million, at least a million young people who are saying, Durbin, get on with it. We want to get this fixed. So if you're talking about something that I'm going to stick with, that's one of the things.
Okay. You know, we have such a shining example in your leadership of what it really means to take the idea of getting civically involved seriously. A lot of folks watching right now are young voters. They might actually be voting for the first time in November, or they might just be trying to figure out how they can engage in ways beyond voting. So what's your pitch to young people or folks generally about why they should become involved in civics?
First, they can make a difference. You know, many elections are decided by a small number of votes. So don't think your vote doesn't count. It does. We elected a sheriff in central Illinois in Macon County by 1 vote, and they're going through a recount right now still. So it really isn't your vote counts. It's important. The second thing is, think about what's important in your view of values and your view of the world. I've mentioned a few things here. We talked about healthcare, eliminating the inequities in healthcare. We talked about doing the right thing to rebuild the economy and give people good jobs that pay something decent for a living. We talked about the whole issue of Black Lives Matter. I mentioned this issue of dreamers. I haven't mentioned some pretty obvious things. Climate change. There are many people who look at the issue of climate change and say, well, these are all well and good, Senator, but if the earth that we live on is going to fry and get too hot and be uninhabitable, what good is it? Well, we can do something about it. And it means electing a president who wants to do something good about it. And that's where the voices of young people can really dramatically make a difference. There's something else that's going on too, which I think is worth saying. And Black Lives Matter reflects it to a great extent, but there's more to it. A few years ago, we had the national debate about marriage equality. And that was an interesting debate because most people would have said, you know, it's likely we'll talk about it, but we won't do anything about it. Well, guess what? We did. And we did it in a dramatic fashion and did it quickly. And I credit the young people in America who basically said, wait a minute, old timer, I don't want to get involved in some debate about who this person loves and doesn't love. That's their business. It's not yours as a politician. And all of a sudden, there was this cultural change in America led by young people who had grown up in a more accepting environment than their parents and grandparents, who said, we want an America that doesn't discriminate based on sexual orientation. And they got it. They got it. They can make a change. They really can. So I encourage them to get involved.
Yeah. You know, Senator, in such perilous times and with the contentious election coming up, what's keeping you motivated? You've talked to us about the issues that are really important. You've talked to us about how you're embracing the issues that are important to some of your colleagues, but what's personally keeping you going, keeping you positive, and keeping you super motivated to continue leading?
Well, there are a lot of things that are important to me. I mentioned the DREAM Act, and I mentioned a lot of things that I've worked on over the years,
Absolutely.
Criminal justice reform. But I will tell you at this point, to be very direct about it, what keeps me going is the thought of November the 4th. That's the Wednesday after the November 3rd election. And if this election, if the American people recapture the presidency with the Democratic president and Joe Biden, starting November the 4th, we're going to start looking around and saying, all right, we've got to undo the damage and we've got to chart a new course for America. I want to be there. I want to be part of that conversation. I want to be in the Senate representing this state of Illinois as part of that conversation too. We got a lot to do, an awful lot to do. To think that President Trump decided to take us out of the Paris Climate Accord, the only country in the world to be taken out of the Paris Climate Accords, makes no sense. We've got to get back in. The NATO alliance, which kept us safe and peaceful for decades after decades, he's made a shambles of that. We've got to reconstruct that. We've got established working relationships with governments around the world that have been our friends traditionally, and now wonder who's leading the United States? What do they believe in? There's so many things that we can do. And I look forward to being a voice in the Senate to help achieve that goal. So that's why I'm motivated.
Well, Senator, it's such a pleasure speaking with you. Can you tell us for one moment where we can follow you? Of course, we know that you can stay engaged with and follow you in the news, of course, but where might people look to some of the upcoming legislation that you're pushing?
Pretty simple. Durbin, Durbin, durbin.senate.gov. That's where you'll find a lot of information about the work that I'm doing. And I invite everybody to participate and be part of it.
All right. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure having